Good morning, welcome back to another Coastie Explores from a very hot and humid Hong Kong, China. Now you don't need to know the time to take this ferry. It's been going about every 6 to 8 minutes for the past 100 years. But the clock on top is a symbol and a significant sign for all of Hong Kong to know exactly what time it is. In today's Coastie Explores, we take a look at the history of time in Hong Kong, from the ancient Chinese methods of timekeeping to the early British era clock towers, learning about the importance of timekeeping to Hong Kong as a port city in the 19th century. Join me as I take a historical wander around the modern city that we see today and have a look at the timepieces that are still around. This is the History of Time, Hong Kong. People have lived on this rocky outcrop of southern China for tens of thousands of years. And for 99.9% of that time, people lived by the sun rising and falling, whether it be the fishermen in the sea or the farmers in the field. Now, time is very much a modern social construct. For most of mankind, wherever you are in the world, time didn't really matter. When shall I see you next for dinner? Well, see you in 5 days at sunset. But now, in this modern age, we rely on time right down to the nanosecond. Now, if you watch the channel, you'll know this is my favourite tree. What's it called again, Jason?
Ubiquitous banyan tree.
Yeah, that's right, the Chinese banyan tree. Although we do know it's now called Ficus microcarpa. Although the other day I watched a couple of documentaries on trees and both experts called it Ficus microcarpa. So if you're a botanist out there, an English one, could you let me know, is it Ficus or Ficus? Let me know. Right now, just like my post office series, and if you haven't seen it, check it out, there's the link above. I'm going to take some questions from my students today. And the first question my students want to know is, what were the earliest forms of timekeeping here in China? That's a great question. For this, we need to head out to the East Coast to the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, I believe. Let's go. Whew, that's a long way. We've made it out to the University of Science and Technology, and here it is, a modern sundial, but a magnificent one, and we can tell exactly what time it is because the shadow is just past the 1, and it is about 1:15 here right now. That is amazing. But what about the history of sundials? Did they originate here in China or somewhere else? Let's delve a little bit deeper. It was the ancient Egyptians who are thought to have invented the sundial around 1200 BC, and it was at this time during the Shang dynasty that the Chinese were using the sundial to determine the epoch of solstices by measuring the length of the sun's shadow. But the first recorded sundial in China for time is thought to be from around 500 BC. This primitive timepiece could be made and used by everybody. Now, next time you're in Hong Kong, do check out this beautiful sundial here at the Chi Lin Nunnery. What a beautiful campus this is. And just wait for this view when I turn the camera around. Not a bad view to be at university. Check this out. And this is why you should come to Hong Kong, everyone. It is an absolutely stunningly beautiful place with great landscapes, the beaches, the mountains. It's got everything here. Get yourself to Hong Kong. Okay, the next question from the kids at school is, did China always use the 24-hour clock, the same as in the West, or did they use another form? Well, that's a great question. And for that, let's leave this sundial behind. Let's head to a Buddhist temple on the Kowloon Peninsula. Let's go.
The ancient Chinese divided the day into 12 two-hour periods known as Shi Qian. The concept of Shi Qian in ancient China was deeply intertwined with the human body, the Chinese zodiac, and the celestial cycles. Each Shi Qian was associated with a specific internal organ and external body part, influencing health and illness. The 12 Shi Qian and the 12 Chinese zodiac signs followed the same cyclical pattern, with each Shi Qian linked to a specific zodiac sign. The celestial bodies were believed to exert influences on human life, and the Shi Qian provided a way to understand and harness these cosmic energies. Other methods which were used, especially at night, were candles and incense sticks. Candle clocks were created by engraving the length of the candle with evenly spaced markings. As the wax burned down, each hour would melt away. Cleverly, the candle clocks could also function as an alarm clock. A nail would be inserted into the candle, the specific time mark, and when the candle burned down to the point, the nail would fall into a metal tray below. You also had the famous incense clock, which were often shaped like a dragon. An incense stick would burn, and every half an hour, a metal ball would drop onto a plate underneath. There's a great example of one of these in the Hong Kong Museum of Art. It is thought that the first mechanical clock in the world was invented by Yi Xing, a Buddhist mathematician and monk in the 8th century. Developed as an astronomical instrument, his water-driven spherical bird's-eye view map of the heavens piece also acted as a clock. The knowledge and principles behind Yi Xing's clock, such as the use of water power and escapement mechanisms, likely influenced the development of European timekeeping devices. His invention undoubtedly led to the cosmic engine built by the Chinese inventor Su Song in the 11th century. At 10 meters high, it was made of bronze and powered by water. At the top, a sphere on a platform kept track of the motion of the planets. The clock remained in place and working until 1126, when it was lost in a Tatar invasion. Water clocks became common in the Forbidden City in Beijing. Here's a copper one from the Qing dynasty. Farmers would also use more rudimentary water clocks to tell the passing of time in the fields. Okay, so the next question from the students is, what was the first modern clock in Hong Kong? Well, clocks as we know them today, they started to be developed in the 13th century, it's thought, with some chiming on the hour every hour to let people know in the villages and the towns exactly what time it was. Now, it's thought that the voyages of the Chinese explorer Zheng He in the 15th century helped with the development of these clocks, the knowledge that he passed down through his travels and through the ancient Silk Road, no doubtedly developed the European clocks that we know today. Now, this is Hollywood Road Park, also known as Possession Point. That's because on January 26, 1841, the British took possession here of Hong Kong Island. So it was probably around that time when the modern clocks started coming to this area of southern China. To find out what I believe to be the first clock here, we need to head round to the west coast to an old castle-looking building and find out more about a Scottish magnate who lived there. But before that, I think it's time for a bit of a haircut. So do excuse me for a second. Now, just before we hit that hairdresser, a beautiful example of a Tong Lao here. This is a shop at the bottom with accommodation above. They were all over Hong Kong, ubiquitous you could say at some point. Got some great ones still up in Guangzhou. Check out my Xiamen Island video for that one. But it's beautiful, a beautiful example right here at the bottom of Possession Street in Sheungwan. Well, look, 4 minutes, 23 seconds. I think that's the quickest haircut I've had, but lots to do. Time waits for no man, so let's head round to the west coast of Hong Kong Island. And here it is. What a marvellous building this is. This is now Hong Kong University Halls here on the west coast of Hong Kong Island, but it was originally built by Douglas LePrake. Now, he was a Scottish magnate, made his money in shipping, although he started off as a watchmaker's apprentice in Macau. When he arrived here, he made a lot of money in shipping and built this house. Now, when this was built in 1861, it looked very much like a castle, hence why it was named Douglas Castle. He named it after himself. Now, in the 1860s, he also funded a clock tower in Central in Pedder Street, the famous Pedder Street clock. Now, that was built in 1862, so this was built before it, but as far as I can see, the clock tower on this building wasn't built in 1861. So we do need to head into Central now to try and find the location of the 1862 Pedder Street clock that Douglas LePrake funded. Let's go. And this is where the Pedder Street clock once stood, right in the middle of the road here in Pedder Street where it meets Queen's Road West. Probably the first and arguably the nicest, grandest clock tower we've ever had here in Hong Kong.
The famous Pedder Street clock chimed for the first time at midnight on the 31st of December 1862, and here's a great photo of it under construction at the time. It was 80 feet tall with a lighted dial, and it was actually supposed to be much grander than it was, but didn't get the support and the funds it needed. Just close by is the Pedder Building, which was built in the 1920s and is one of the last pre-World War II buildings in this downtown area of Central. The clock tower stood proud of place just up from Pedder Wharf, which is where visiting dignitaries and royals would alight from their jetty boats. The first one being 1869, when the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son, arrived in Hong Kong on his world tour on board the ship HMS Galatea. I love this old photo of the Triumph Arch that he would have walked through as he arrived in Hong Kong. Now, I love this photo of Pedder Street from the late 1880s. The building on the left was the Dent Company, one of Hong Kong's richest companies. It was knocked down in 1889 and later became the Grand Hong Kong Hotel, which we can see in this photo, until one of Hong Kong's largest ever fires destroyed the hotel in 1926. The clock tower stood proud, telling the people of Hong Kong the time until 1913, when it was taken down. It was seen as an obstruction, as it was right in the middle of one of Hong Kong's busiest thoroughfares. And it wasn't until 2 decades later that Hong Kong would get a clock tower on the island of such grandeur, and that was in 1933 with the building of the Gloucester Hotel Clock Tower.
Now we can't wait around here all day. We've got to get to Causeway Bay now because it's a very famous event that happens every day at 12 o'clock and has done since the 1860s. So let's get moving. In 7 years, I've actually never seen the Noonday Gun fire. Been there a couple of times, but not at 12 o'clock, so I'm very, very excited. Now, if you want to come and visit the Noonday Clock, it's not easy, but if you follow Google Maps, you'll get there. You've got to find this alleyway, to find this doorway, go down these set of stairs, through this car park, up this ramp, and there you'll find the Noonday Gun as soon as you pop out into the open again. Good luck.
This is the famous Noonday Gun immortalised in Noel Coward's 1931 song Mad Dogs and Englishmen, with the lyrics, "In Hong Kong they strike a gong and fire off the Noonday Gun to reprimand each inmate who's in late." So every day this gun is fired out into the harbour at 12 p.m. noon precisely. But where did this custom originate, I hear you say? Let's find out. Well, the story goes back to an alleged incident that happened in the 1860s, when an important taipan, which means a wealthy businessman, arrived by boat to Hong Kong. An employee of the wealthy Jardine Matheson Company would fire a 21-gun salute over Victoria Harbour from here in East Point. Now, incidentally, this piece of land is known as Lot Number 1, and it was actually the first to be auctioned off by the British in the early 1840s. Anyway, this practice of firing a salute annoyed a British Royal Navy officer, or possibly the governor at the time, for the practice was supposed to be reserved for an admiral or the governor himself, not a mere merchant. This official then issued a penalty to Jardine Matheson to fire the gun on a daily basis at noon. A representative of the company still comes out every day, fires the gun, and then allows tourists to have a photo taken next to him and the gun. The Noonday Gun actually allowed ships in the harbour to be able to set their chronometers to the correct times so that navigation was more accurate, but this would change in the 1880s, as we'll soon find out.
Now here's a picture of Noel Coward here in 1965 next to the Noonday Gun. And then look at this one of Stephen Hendry right next to this cannon from 1987. Apparently he didn't like Chinese food until he came to Hong Kong for the first time when he was at a tournament. So there we go. Check out that mullet of his as well. Now here's a fascinating fact. Right above me, there are two flags flying. One is the Jardine Matheson Company flag and the other one is the Scottish flag, the Saltaire. And that's because both Mr. Jardine and Mr. Matheson were both Scotsmen. And that's why the Saltaire and the Jardine Matheson flag fly above here today. So there we go, the famous Noonday Gun here in Hong Kong. Come check it out if you're on holiday or if you live here. Now, time to head back to Central to see two iconic clock towers. Let's go. And we've made it back to Central Ferry Pier for another question from the kids. And this one is, how many Central Ferry Piers have there been and did they all have clock towers? Well, what a great question. Let's find out.
Now, as far as I can see, there have been 4 permanent Central Ferry terminals here in Hong Kong. We're currently on reclaimed land here, so the first generation pier with a wooden roof and a simple design in the late 1880s would have been about 1 kilometre inland, close to where the Triumph Arch would have stood. After a temporary pier at the turn of the century, the second generation pier was built and was the first to have a clock on top of it, and was quite iconic in its day. Located at the end of Icehouse Street, this was in the early 1910s, when most people could not afford the luxury of a watch, so so knowing the time was much needed. Here's a fun fact: in the early days you could buy a ticket at this ferry pier for London. Your journey would start with this 5-minute harbour crossing before catching a train through China via Beijing and along the Trans-Siberian Railway in Russia, all the way to London, a distance of over 8,000 miles. The third generation was built on reclaimed land in the late 1950s in the streamlined modern style. It seems that the clock tower was an additional feature by a separate architect. The chimes of the turret clock installed at the pier marked every quarter hour since the pier's inauguration in 1957. The clock was actually a gift from John Keswick, who had in turn received it from the Prince of Belgium. The mechanism was manufactured by British company Edward Dent, which also provided the mechanical signature to the Big Ben of London. And this finally brings us to the fourth generation Star Ferry Pier we see today, which was built in 2006, and it's thought that they did try to replicate the second generation design in some way.
Well, unfortunately, time has beaten me for this episode. We're going to jump on the Star Ferry now, so you can join me next time when we go over to Kowloon side and find out all about the history of clocks, watches, and the watchmaking industry here in Hong Kong from about the 1880s onwards. So join me next time, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Coastie Explores. Bye for now.